I'd like you to imagine that you and I have been asked by our management to deploy a SQL Server virtual machine. Let's imagine it's going to be that guy right there. Now, as part of that deployment, we're going to choose the data store to be the home for that VM's files. And so far in our lab environment, we have some VMFS-based data stores. Each of our ESXi hosts has a directly connected data store, and we have some data stores based on iSCSI targets. We also have an NFS-based data store. And based on a few nuggets ago, we also have a vSAN-based data store. So when we deploy our SQL Server, instead of having to choose, for example, a specific VMFS data store, or a specific NFS data store, or a vSAN data store, instead we can go ahead and simply associate a policy, specifically a storage policy, and then based on that policy, vCenter can show us a list of data stores compatible with that policy. And the question may come up, well, what are some of the things that could be considered as part of that policy? We could have redundancy, and what I'm going to refer to as fault tolerance. For example, when we deployed our vSAN, and we said we want 3 ESXi hosts to participate in that, it automatically created for us a vSAN default policy that said it should be able to support the failure of any single host. So that's where the fault tolerance and redundancy comes in regarding the vSAN data store. And policies aren't just based on the feature sets and capabilities from the storage provider. They can also be based on tags. For example, let's say we take our iSCSI 1 data store and we statically associate a tag with that of West Coast. And then as an example, if we took iSCSI 2 and we gave that a static label of East Coast, then with those labels in place, what we could do is we could create a policy that says the tag West Coast or East Coast has to be associated with the data store to match this policy. So when we're deploying a virtual machine, for example on the West Coast, and we want to make sure we're using a West Coast data store, we could just refer to the policy that's looking for the specific tag on the data store, and that would give us a list of the possible data stores that match that policy. For our lab, let's make this our game plan. Let's go ahead and create some tags. We'll create a tag called West Coast tag and Bronze tag. For each of those tags, we'll put them in the category of West Coast data store category and storage that is meh category for the Bronze tag. And then we'll assign the tags as follows. iSCSI 1 and iSCSI 2 will both get the West Coast tag, and the NFS will get the Bronze tag. And then we can create policies based on matching those tags, and then we can assign the VM storage policies to individual VMs, and we can check to see whether they're compliant with their storage policy. So here on our Windows management computer, let's go ahead and open up the vSphere web client by double-clicking on that icon on the desktop. And regarding the digital certificate provided by vCenter Server Appliance, we'll click on Advanced. We'll scroll down and click on Proceed to vcsa.nuggetlab.com. So periodically that does come up, and the reason is that our browser doesn't trust the certificate. It caches that for a while, and then periodically it's going to prompt us and warn us again. So we'll go ahead and authenticate as administrator at nuggetlab.com and supply our lab password and click Login. Now that we're logged in, let's go to the home page. We'll click on the home icon and then click from the menu Home. And from here we have an icon for VM storage policies. So before we create and assign any tags, let's take a look at the existing VM storage policies by clicking on that icon right here. So there's a VM encryption policy, a virtual volume related policy, and also a vSAN default storage policy. So with that highlighted, let's click on Edit Settings regarding the vSAN default storage policy. And in the rule set for this vSAN storage policy, it's set up to be redundant to tolerate one host failure. And also as part of this policy, it's specifying number of disk stripes per object is going to be 1. So if we increase those numbers, for example, let's say we wanted to tolerate 2 host failures, and we wanted 3 disk stripes per object, it's going to recalculate the storage consumption over here on the right. So here it's showing us that a 100 gigabyte data store would require 300 gigabytes to actually support it because of all the redundancy. If we reduce those numbers, for example, if we went back to number of failures to tolerate and we put a 1 there, it recalculates. And now it's showing us to get 100 gigabytes, we'd need 200 gigabytes of storage space. And if we set the number of disk stripes back down to 1 as well, again, it does a recalculation. By default, the forced provisioning is set to a no, which means that even if we assign a policy to a VM and there's no data stores that support that policy, it'll still allow the provisioning. If we specify yes for forced provisioning, that's going to force our hand, and that if we specify a policy and there's no data stores that match that policy, it won't be able to continue and actually deploy the VM. So I'm going to leave the default of no. Also, as part of this policy, we have the option for object space reservations. So if we were deploying a VM that had a 20 gig hard drive and we wanted to guarantee at least half of that right up front, we could go ahead and put 50%. And as part of the storage policy, it would make sure that 50% of that VM's hard disk space was allocated as thick provisioned, and above 50%, it could then follow the thin provisioning and just grow as needed above the 50% that's already committed. There's also an option here for the flash read cache reservation. So if we associated a percentage of the flash read cache in this policy and we applied this policy to a VM, then that VM would be guaranteed that flash read cache. And then here on the left, it's going to show us our storage that's compatible with this policy. So if we click on compatible, we've got our vSAN data store, which is compatible with that policy. And if we click on incompatible, it shows us all of our data stores which are not compatible with that policy that we're currently looking at. So if we click on cancel here and deploy a new VM, if we deploy this policy, that indicates we need to have vSAN storage that can tolerate at least a single host failure. The VM that gets assigned this policy would be using the vSAN data store as the resting place for its files. So this is what we get by default. If we wanted to do storage policies based on a tag that we have associated with the data store, there's several ways of doing that, but they all involve creating new tags and then assigning those tags to data stores and then using those tags as part of storage policies. So if we click on the home icon and then click on the home from the dropdown, on the left-hand side, we have a link for tags and custom attributes. If we click on that, there's no tags defined, but we can fix that by simply clicking on the plus symbol to create a new tag. And per our plan, let's call this West Coast tag. And from the category, we're going to create a new category. So from the dropdown, we'll click on New Category. So let's name this West Coast Data Stores category. And for our purpose, we're going to go ahead and specify that this tag is going to apply just to data stores. So we'll put a check here next to data store. And I'm also, just for grins, going to click on data store cluster as well, which simply means that we could use this tag associated with either a data store or a data store cluster, and then click on OK. So now we have this beautiful West Coast tag. We could then go to a data store and associate that data store with this tag. So to do that, let's hover over the home icon, and then from the drop-down, let's click on Storage to go to that view. So here under the Storage view, if we right-click on iSCSI1, and from the Actions menu for iSCSI1, if we go down to Tags and Custom Attributes, we can click here on Assign Tag on the submenu. So we'll click on Assign Tag, and currently we only have one tag, so we'll go ahead and select that, click on Assign, and now if we click on iSCSI1 on the left, and we see here in this tags window that it currently has the West Coast tag associated with it. So if we wanted to associate iSCSI2 with that tag, we could right click on iSCSI2, from the drop down, hover over Tags and Custom Attributes, then from the submenu click on Assign Tag, and choose that same tag, and then click on Assign. And because when we created the tag, we also said this could be used to tag a data store cluster, we could also, if we wanted to, right click on the data store cluster, go to Tags and Custom Attributes, click on Assign Tag, and also associate the cluster itself with this tag. So with it selected, we'll click on Assign. So now, if we use that tag inside of a storage policy, the data stores that will be compliant would be iSCSI2, iSCSI1, and data store cluster. They would all be compliant. Also, since we're here and we need to associate a tag with the NFS data store as well, let's right-click on the NFS data store here on the left. From the Action menu for the NFS data store, let's hover on Tags and Custom Attributes, and then click on Assign Tag from the submenu. Now from here, we don't have a tag called Bronze Tag, but we could create one. So if we click on this Create Tag icon right here, what it's going to do is it's going to minimize our current task into the work in progress and effectively allow us to create a new tag, and then we can return to our work in progress. So let's call this Bronze Tag per our plan, and from the category, we're going to create a new category, and we'll call the category name Storage that is meh category. And also, because we started the process of creating the new tag when we were working with the data store, it is already selecting for us the fact that this tag can be applied to a data store. So we'll go ahead and click on OK. So now that that tag exists, we can now associate that tag with the NFS data store, simply by selecting the Bronze tag, clicking on OK, and now if we click on the NFS data store, it's got the Bronze tag associated with it. So now, as we create our storage policies, we could reference the tags and then subsequently assign those storage policies to VMs. So let's create a couple of storage policies. To do that, we'll go ahead and hover on the home icon, and then we'll go ahead and click on Home from the menu. Here's an icon right here for VM storage policies on the home page. So we'll click on VM storage policies. And if we want to create a new storage policy, we simply click on the link to create a new VM storage policy. So let's create the new policy called West Coast Storage Policy and click on Next. It's giving us a little overview regarding creating storage policies. We'll click on Next. If we want some common rules associated with this storage policy, things like caching or I/O control or encryption, we could go ahead and put a check in this checkbox and then add the components to identify what we want to apply. Or we could leave that checkbox empty and simply click on Next and go to our rule set. So for our rule, what we want to do is we want to match any data stores that have a tag of quote-unquote West Coast tag. So from the storage type, from the drop-down, we'll click on tag-based placement. And then for our rule, we'll go ahead and use the drop-down and select tags from category. And then from the category drop-down, we'll specify West Coast data stores category. And from that category, we have the option of tagged with any one of or exclude tagged with any one of. What we're looking for is a data store that is tagged with one of. And then click on Add Tags. And we only have one tag in that category, which is the West Coast tag. So with that selected, we'll go ahead and click on OK. And that's our rule. So if we click on Next, it's next going to show us what's compatible with that. So with compatible highlighted, it's showing us that our data store cluster, including the two iSCSI data stores, are compatible with this policy. And if we click on Incompatible, it's giving a list of all the data stores that don't have that tag associated with them. So we'll click on Next, and we'll click on Finish, and we now have a policy called West Coast Storage Policy. And just for grins, let's create one more for the meh. So we'll click on Create VM Storage Policy. So we'll call this meh storage policy. Click on Next. Click on Next. We're not going to use common rules for this. We'll click on Next. We want to look for the specific tag. So we'll go ahead and from the provider, we'll select tag-based placement. From the drop-down for Add Rule, we'll click Tags from Category. From the category, we'll go ahead and select storage that is meh. And then in that category, we have one tag, the bronze tag that we want to match on, and we'll click on OK. Then we'll click on Next. It's going to look at storage compatibility and show us everything that's compatible with that. So compatible, we have the NFS data store with that tag, and incompatible, everything else. So we'll click on Next. There's a quick summary, and we'll click on Finish. So if we have a VM that needs some fault tolerance with vSAN, we can use this policy. If we have a VM that wants a data store on the West Coast, we can use this policy. And if we have a VM that wants meh storage, we can use this policy. And I'm not beating up NFS. I'm just talking about the fact that we may have different storage capabilities, different speeds, different performance types. And by creating policies that reflect that, we can use those policies when creating VMs and not have to manually remember which data store types support which features or functions. So with these policies in place, let's go ahead and apply one of them. So we'll go ahead and hover over the home icon and click on home to go to the home page. Let's click on VMs and templates on the left-hand side. And let's click on small VM and then click on the summary page for that small VM. And for related objects, I'm going to drag that up here a little bit higher so we can see it easier. So currently it's using the vSAN data store based on this information right here. So if we right-clicked on the small VM and from the menu clicked on Edit Settings, here's where we could go ahead and change the storage policy for this VM. So if we expand the hard disk one, and then for the VM storage policy, we use the drop-down arrow. Let's go ahead and specify the West Coast storage policy. And with that change, we'll go ahead and click on OK. So the reality is that this small VM is still using the vSAN data store. And on the Summary tab, if we scroll down a little bit, I want to go ahead and bring this a little bit higher, the VM storage policies, to bring that up near the top. So I'm going to inch that up a little bit so we can see it. In fact, I'm going to bring it up a little bit higher. And at the moment, this is still reflecting that it's using the virtual SAN default storage policy and that it's compliant, but I think that we need a refresh. So I'm going to click on the refresh icon up here to get the latest and greatest information. And now as a result, it's showing it being non-compliant, meaning it's not compliant with its storage policy. And if we click on this link right here, check compliance, it can go out and verify that once again for us. Also, if we go to our storage policies, let's do that. Let's hover over the home icon and click on home from the dropdown. And then from the home page, let's click on VM storage policies right here. And on the left, let's click on the West Coast storage policy to select it. And then if we click on monitor regarding that policy, it's showing us currently that we have one VM that's associated with that policy. However, it is non-compliant, meaning it's not following the policy. If we clicked here on storage compatibility, it once again shows us in the compatible section all the data stores that are compatible with that policy, And by clicking on the incompatible option, it shows us all the data stores that are not compatible. So going back to VMs and virtual disk, this is pretty handy to verify whether or not we have certain VMs that are compliant or not with a specific storage policy. So to fix that, we could click here on the small VM to take us to that VM. And then we could right click on the small VM on the left. From the menu, select Migrate. We'll go ahead and specify we want to change storage only by checking that radio button. Click on Next. And then from here, for the VM storage policy, if we use the drop down and then scroll to the very bottom, it's alphabetical here, we could choose the West Coast storage policy. And furthermore, we could go ahead and specify the provisioning type we want to use. And then it's showing us what's compatible with that policy. So currently it's showing us the data store cluster. If we wanted to disable storage DRS, it then shows us the individual data stores that are compatible with that policy. So let's use storage DRS. By removing that check mark, we'll use the data store cluster, which is compatible with the policy, and then after selecting it, we'll click on Next. Here's a summary of what it's about to do. We can look at the recommendations from storage DRS right here by clicking on this link. And its recommendation is to use iSCSI2. So we'll take its primary recommendation, click on Apply, and then click on Finish. And if we click on Recent Tasks, it's now doing that migration over to the data store that matches the policy associated with that virtual machine. So now that it's done, if we minimize recent tasks, and then with small VM selected on the Summary tab, right here it's showing that it's now compliant with the West Coast storage policy, and we could click on Check Compliance. And that would go out once again in real time to verify the compliance of the storage policy with that VM's files. So in this nugget, we've identified that we can create storage policies, associate those with VMs to help confirm that we're getting the right type of data stores associated with our VMs. And that those policies can be based on features or functionality like fault tolerance built into a storage system, or it can be based on tags. So have some fun in the labs and practicing what we've covered in this nugget, and I'll see you in the next video. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.